The lower classes of the 18th century were forbidden from owning their own weapons. At sea, weapons were kept out of the sailors' hands by being stored in the gunner's locker. Of course, this did not prevent fights, muggings, brawls, and mutiny. The restrictions simply had to be circumvented. In a pinch, pretty much anything hard or sharp enough can be used as a weapon to stab vital bits or bludgeon a skull. A wooden ship was full of dangerous implements, which, while far from conventional, or maybe even effective, could be taken up and used for destructive ambitions. The previous episode left off at cudgels, wooden sticks used for bashing brains in. An implement with a potential likeness was the belaying pin. The word belay meant to fasten a small rope by winding it several times around an object, usually a cleat, kevel, or the aforementioned belaying pins. This might be necessary when heaving a halyard to hoist a sail, flag, or yard. Belay also became sailor slang for stop, as in belay that. Known as a cabilon to the French, and they were not especially popular on their vessels in the 1600s, but appeared more in the 18th. What made the belaying pin so good was that it could be moved between different, strategically located pin rails around the ship, wherever a line had to be belayed. Its mobility also enabled it as a weapon. Belaying pins were made of hardwood like ash or oak, and often measured about 18 inches, 45 centimeters in length. The length and material made them a decent weapon, and they were used much like a baton, which they greatly resemble and may be confused for. A similar weapon of bludgeoning intentions would be the capstan bar. Capstan bars were timber rods, either round or square shaped, usually with tapered ends, inserted into the slots of a winch or capstan in order to turn them. These were large, rotary machines used in hauling large lines for hoisting anchors or heavy yards. You might have seen it in Pirates of the Caribbean, where it's used to summon the Kraken. Work in the capstan was typically accompanied by a rudimentary work song, such as Heave Ho or Un deux trois, which developed into the sea shanty in the late 18th century. Owing to their weight, length, and thickness, the capstan bar could serve as a two-handed club. If you really wanted to go overboard, oars could be used in a similar purpose, as was documented per the intro. The flat end of the blade could be used for smacking, and the edge as a sort of wooden axe. Though unlikely to decapitate, it would certainly hurt. However, many oars were simply too long to be swung as a weapon, and only the ones from the smallest of boats would have been feasible. The mallet was a short wooden hammer, with a concave furrow in the top of its head, used to press down on ropes during a process called worming, parceling, and serving. The grooves of the rope are lined with additional twine, wrapped in canvas, and then tied up again. This protects the rope against moisture and chafing. Pressure is applied by the mallet to ensure an even result. And in a pinch, the mallet could be used as a weapon. Pirate Captain John Phillips faced a mutiny from his forced men, one of which was named Edward Cheeseman. He used the mallet to break the captain's jaw, and then for wounding the quartermaster, John Rose Archer. Archer was spared in order to prove the mutineer's innocence, and he was later hanged in Boston. The crowbar, simply called a crow in the 1600s, was a frequent tool aboard wooden ships. Much like the spike on boarding axes, it was used for prying open doors and chests to get to the plunder. They were also used by artillerymen to lever up the heavy breech of the cannon, so the wooden wedges called coins could be moved in order to adjust the barrel's elevation. These crowbars were a formidable, two-handed club. A 12-pounder gun had a 4-foot, 120cm crowbar, weighing 22 pounds 10 kilos. That would be almost impossible to swing for all but the strongest men. Wooden handspikes were another artillery implement, used in shifting the carriage left to right. They were about the same length as the crow, but weighed half as much. Owing to their point, they could possibly be used for thrusting. It's easy to imagine a desperate gun crew wading into melee with crows, handspikes, rammers, and linstocks. Going back to the smaller implements, the chisel was a favorite of mutineers. They were used both by blacksmiths and carpenters, guaranteeing their presence on wooden ships. Many were found in the wreck of La Belle. Once sharpened, they could be used as a knife. William Moore was seen sharpening one against a grinding stone when planning his mutiny against William Kidd. Moore never got his chance before Kidd took up an iron-bound bucket and struck him in the head. The would-be mutineer received a skull fracture and died a few days later. Kidd was later convicted on charges of murder, despite sea captains having the legal right to crack down like this. Either way, Kidd was a physically imposing fellow and might have put literally anything to good use, so this incident doesn't necessarily guarantee the bucket's place as a guaranteed tool for slaughter. The marlin spike, also called a fid or handspike, were used for sewing sails, tying and untying large knots, and splicing. Splicing is the act of joining two ropes by opening the strands and then using a fid to lay them orderly over the other. It seems though the fish, marlin, is named after the marlin spike, and not the other way around. The word marlin refers to the practice of winding twine around larger ropes, as a form of protection. There were two types of fid. The heavier sort were made from iron, and used for working light ropes. Lighter fids were made from bone or heavy wood, but were also larger than the iron sort. These were used for working cables, which are free ropes twisted together. Large iron fids would have been too heavy for splicing cables. Fids were usually carried in a leather pouch, either by individual seamen or by the ship's bosun, a minor officer in charge of the rigging. Their accessibility made them an obvious choice for mutinies. At first, the most apparent use appears to be a thrusting attack. According to one source, sail needles were stabbed at victims running the gauntlet. However, it seems that the weight made them better as a club. Captain Phillips, who was later killed by a mallet, was once given a dangerous head wound by a marlin spike, spontaneously taken up by a merchant captain. Phillips recovered and struck back with his sword. They could also be used as a throwing projectile. Beechwood appears to have been a common material for marlin spikes. It was also used for barrels, rigging blocks, and sword scabbards, owing to its hardness, strength, and durability. This made it an excellent weapon. The rigging blocks could easily get severed during combat, fall, and stove someone's head in. I had the idea of pirates using blocks still attached to their ropes as a flail, maybe even with a fishing net if you want to go full gladiator, but I've never found any documentation of either. However, merchant sailors did use a type of flail called the slung shot. This bizarre icon of brutal creativity must have been effective, because it was banned from use aboard naval vessels. It consisted of an iron grape shot, so a small cannonball pretty much, attached or slung to an 18-inch 45cm lanyard, terminating in an eye splice for the hand. The shot was swung at an opponent's head. Sailors armed themselves with these weapons on shore, and seems to have put considerable pride in them. The slings were often intricately woven using their advanced knotwork, and some could be considered works of art. I guess you could count the grappling hook as a type of flail, since it's an iron object attached to a line. Usually called a grapnel in the 1600s, it was a small sort of iron anchor, furnished with 4 opposite-facing flukes, the ends of which were barbed. They were attached to a line and flung over to an enemy ship to secure themselves in the rigging and woodwork, after which the crew hauled at the lines to draw the ships close in order to board them. The defender would try to clear the grappling hook lines using boarding axes. Similar implements were also used as anchors in galleys and rowboats. The grappling hook might sometimes have become an unintentional weapon. When swinging them over at the enemy, it's not hard to imagine one accidentally hitting an enemy's head, so I guess they could be used as a type of flail. Just about everyone loved to smoke in the 1600s, and while most smokers didn't realize that smoking kills, some understood it, but in a more figurative, or perhaps literal sense, depending on your point of view. The favorite method of smoking was using clay pipes. Being handheld and breakable, they could actually be used as a weapon. In 1788, a Welshman named Sylvanus Owen was found guilty of manslaughter. He punched a man who was smoking a pipe, causing the pipe to enter his eye and cause a serious infection. Such strikes could lead to serious puncture wounds to the brain or neck. Pipes could also be used in torture, to burn someone, or crushed up and loaded into pistols. They might be broken off or sharpened and used as knives, and there's evidence of their use in surgery. Medical publications argued for the use of pipe stems as catheters to relieve both men and women of retained urine. In a similar vein to the pipe, there were surely cases when 2 pirates had a drink, one got angry, took up a bottle, and smashed it into his opponent's head. Bottles could be used as a primitive hammer, or simply smashed and used to stab with the broken glass. More effective might have been to crush the bottle into pieces and load it into muskets and blunderbusses. Spoons! Were they ever used as a weapon?
I'm gonna cut your heart out with a spoon!
They could be considered a weaponized plot device when reading Captain Johnson's chapter on Anne Bonny. I felt like carving my eyes out with a spoon after reading that. Basically, Johnson made up a story where Bonnie was conceived in a love affair, which was discovered after a maid was thought to have stolen a triple of silver spoons. If you want to learn more, you can watch my video on the subject. Forks would probably have been better weapons, especially when loaded into cannons.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
And no, you cannot use spoons to eat ship's biscuit. Stop asking me this. No one has asked me this. Also known as hardtack since the 1800s, this was a round piece of bread baked several times to make it long-lasting and hard as a rock. It usually became infested with bugs and had to be crushed or soaked to become edible. Otherwise, it was an effective weapon against scurvy teeth, if it wasn't flat out used as an actual weapon. And yes, there is a documented instance of pirates using biscuit to beat someone up. In 1726, a group of pirates were put on trial in Boston, most notably two men named James Muse and John Baptist. Of note is that Muse was a Native American. Anyway, Muse and Baptist had taken a sloop, and whilst plundering the vessel, Baptist started calling the captain all sorts of names. They stole a bunch of his personal items, then Baptist ordered the captain to go to Muse for bread. Muse took up a bag of hardtack and started beating the captain with it, calling him a bunch of demonetized words. This has to be one of the weirdest stories in pirate history. It's a good way of rounding off the video. I hope you enjoyed this series on melee weaponry. If you haven't watched the previous episodes on actual weapons and swords, I'd suggest you give them a look. In the coming months, I will make a series on gunpowder weaponry, including small arms, swivel guns, and explosives. So stay tuned. As usual, thank you to my generous supporters over on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to my videos and can watch them without ads. And if you want to interact with fellow pirate enthusiasts, check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Cheerio!